this is a military enforcement of the sanctions. And that raises it. When you're willing to put your military in there because you're willing to risk a clash with the Russians by doing it, this is where Europe needs to be positioned. I mean, they've passed 19 packages of sanctions. They have tried to put limits on Russian oil. They have tried to say we're coming out of all purchases of Russian oil and gas by 2027. But if Russia's going to continue to ship oil, getting around the sanctions and finding customers for that oil, what do? You have to cut off the source. And what's the source here? It's the tankers. They're the ones that are carrying the oil. So I think this is a logical step. And if you actually read the statements, both in terms of European leaders who have favored the tightened sanctions and of President Zelensky, this is what they've been hinting at. President Zelensky has been hinting at Europe, take stronger measures against the shadow fleet. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't just simply mean putting these vessels on the sanctions list. It means actually enforcing the sanctions list by seizing the tankers and saying you're operating illegally.
Joining us today is Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lucas.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for having me here.
Let's begin our session with Ukraine war negotiations. Russia will withdraw from negotiations if Ukraine fails to cede Donbas to Russia, according to Bloomberg. Is this a make or break moment for Ukraine and Russia?
Well, I just think, Daniel, that this report, which came out in Bloomberg, probably from Russian officials, is just the Kremlin thumping its chest and saying, you have to surrender to us. You and I have discussed for weeks now that even if you have talks between Ukraine and Russia and the United States, that the Kremlin is not giving up its maximum demands on Ukraine. And even though there was a report over the weekend that Russia may now accept security guarantees for Ukraine, this was said by President Zelensky's chief of staff, Mr. Budanov. Even if Russia is willing to concede on the security guarantees, they're not willing to concede on seizing all of Donetsk. And I think also I've mentioned that the Kremlin can't afford to give up that demand because this is Vladimir Putin's legacy. If he can't give all of Ukraine over to Russians as part of a greater Russia, he at least wants to have the Donbas. The question here is okay, how do people respond to that Russian threat to pull out of the talks? I think for Ukraine, it's a fairly simple response. It is, no, you're not going to get the Donbas. No, we can't give up territory. Constitutionally, we can't give up territory without a referendum. But we're also not going to give up what is strategically important territory, and we're not going to concede on our sovereignty. So if Ukraine's not going to concede on that, the question is, well, what position will the Trump administration take? Will the Trump administration say, oh gosh, yeah, Russia should really have all of the Donbas. It's really not fair. And so we have an end to the talks, and we have the Trump people again lining up with the Kremlin, which they have done from time to time over the past more than 13 months. Or will the Trump camp say, no, it's realistic for Ukraine to call for a ceasefire on the basis of the front lines. We're going to stand alongside Kyiv and say to the Russians that this is where this has to wind up, and you have to pull back on your demand for all of Donbas. Is that the line they take? So I think the American reaction is going to be very, very important here. I think we know that Ukraine was not in these talks in the expectation that the Kremlin would compromise. I think we know that Ukraine's in these talks and that Europe is supporting Ukraine in these talks because this is a way of putting pressure on the Russians. That if the Russians are not going to compromise, then finally the Americans will realize they have to come in alongside Europe in terms of defending Ukraine, and that this could be a defense for some time. Something that the Trump camp has walked away from. Those are the tactics that are in play, and I don't think this Russian statement really changes much.
Also, according to Bloomberg, Russia is ready to withdraw troops from Ukrainian northeastern Sumy and Kharkiv regions, as well as from Dnipropetrovsk region as part of the possible deal, and wouldn't press demands for more territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Could we face any kind of wider opening for better compromise here?
Again, I would like to give you grounds for optimism, but this is not a change in the Russian position. I can remember before last year, as Vladimir Putin met Donald Trump in Alaska, this was the line the Russians took, which is you give us Donetsk, you give us all of the Donbas, and then we'll give back small amounts of territory that we've tried to seize and indeed had seized up in Sumy and in Kharkiv in the northeast, and we won't push for any further territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia. And it's like, well, no, that's not the way this works, folks. Just because Russia, and they put in a lot of effort in 2025 to seize that strip along the Ukraine border in the northeast so they could have a bargaining chip. Just because you have this bargaining chip doesn't mean you get to cash it in. And that we give up all of Donetsk. And similarly, just because you say, oh, well, we're not going to demand all of Zaporizhia, we're not going to demand all of Kherson, including areas that Russia lost in the Ukraine counteroffensive in 2022. Just because you say you're not going to want to seize more territory in the south doesn't mean that you get to seize territory in the east. So again, I know why Bloomberg's reporting it. And I mean, I know why the Russian officials are saying it, but I hope analysts out here will simply call this out. This isn't a serious compromise that's being put by the Russians. These are tactics, simply tactics. And again, the main audience for those tactics are probably going to be Donald Trump's envoys and his officials.
You just mentioned about Alaska summit. Also, according to this Bloomberg reporting, Putin, a day before the Alaska summit, organized a meeting with his top officials in the Kremlin. And, quote, it was the same room where he had staged a TV meeting with officials days before the invasion began. And Putin asked officials whether they would support US offer to end the war in Ukraine. And, quote, initially silent officials rose one by one to speak, and the majority supported the proposal, arguing that the war should end. Could this mean that there is more appetite inside the Kremlin to end this war among Putin's inner circle?
Yeah, but what exactly was the American proposal to end the war last August? I mean, as far as we know, going into August, the Kremlin had been working hard at manipulating Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy, the real estate developer, into accepting demands such as the ones that I've set out. And that is, again, primarily that Donetsk, we get the rest of Donetsk, and the rest of Ukraine is kept relatively weak. No entry into NATO, no significant Western military aid, no foreign troops inside Ukraine to give it support. Well, if that's the American proposal that was on the table in Alaska, yeah, of course the Russians are going to accept it. It gives them primarily what they want. Now, if the Americans' proposal was something different, if the American proposal was a ceasefire on the front lines and then we'll discuss these issues, it would be something if Russian officials supported a ceasefire on the current front lines, because I've seen no sign that the Kremlin has favored that or is going to accept it. So I need more here. I really need more. And I've got respect for Bloomberg as a reporting organization, but folks, what you need to critically evaluate what the Russian officials are feeding you. You really do. And I think if there's a wider significance to these stories coming out, the Russians are working really, really hard to shift the narrative in case we do get another set of trilateral talks, or to shift the narrative to justify why they are not going to go into trilateral talks, and to say, look, we're the ones who are supposedly being reasonable here. Why doesn't Kyiv give us what we want?
Let's also cover these optimistic statements, surprise statements from General Budanov, head of the President Zelensky office. He said, quote, Putin has agreed to accept US security guarantees. Budanov added that Russian army is not preparing to advance on Kyiv anytime soon. He also expressed confidence in the prospects of a peace talks. I have also personally watched this big interview he has done with probably largest Ukrainian media during this weekend, during the last days. It was surprise statements from his side. How do you read this?
Yeah, I mean, again, in terms of substance, I need more here. I mean, you know, we've critiqued the Kremlin. Now we need to critique the Zelensky government, and that is okay. If Kirill Budanov is saying, well, they're going to agree to security guarantees. Which security guarantees are they agreeing to? You know, are they agreeing to all of the proposals for the security guarantees? That includes European troops inside Ukraine as part of ensuring that the ceasefire holds. Well, the Kremlin has never agreed to that. And in fact, they've always said they will attack if European troops are inside Ukraine. Are the Russians agreeing to Ukraine getting significant military aid from the West to maintain its defenses against any future invasion? Are the Russians agreeing to U.S. involvement in the security guarantees overseeing air power? Or are the Russians merely agreeing to, and we already knew this, they're merely agreeing to monitoring arrangements of the ceasefire, which could be considered security guarantees. And we know that last week, that's what President Zelensky was focused on, that while the political track of the talks was not going well, the military track was making an advance on the monitoring arrangements for the ceasefire. So if I don't have details there, I'm like, okay, it's limited in terms of what I can say in terms of the significance. But then I've got a wider question, which is, why does Mr. Budanov say this now? My immediate reading of that, and I'm happy, be interested if viewers come in and give me their perspective on it, and if you gave me your perspective on it. But my reading of it is that this is Ukraine trying to bounce Russia, or maybe more accurately, put Russia in a corner, which says, look, you've agreed to security guarantees. So if the Russians then come back and say, either as part of their propaganda or say in the talks, no, we don't agree to the security guarantees. We've never agreed to this. This makes them look like the bad guys, right? So, you sort of set this out that Russia has made a compromise just for the possibility, or maybe even the expectation, that when the Kremlin does not compromise, again, the Americans back you. The Americans don't just simply say, oh, okay, the Kremlin has rejected this and we're going to accept Russia's line.
That's really interesting possible mind games and negotiation tactics between both sides. And also, despite the big war in Iran, in the Middle East, Russia and Ukraine still expect planned US-led peace talks to happen probably in Istanbul, according to Bloomberg. What are your expectations? Because many analysts and media reporting say that this could be like make or break moment. Last meetings before we have any kind of outcome.
I would be really surprised if we get that type of meeting, especially a significant meeting. Look, what's happened in the last, I'm speaking to you on a Monday, so what's happened since Saturday with the Israel-US war, and it is a war on Iran, that completely changes the dynamics. I mean, just think of the comparison. When I'm talking to you last week, I talked to you and Sophia on Thursday, we were in the midst of Donald Trump's envoys. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were in Geneva. Now they were talking to Ukrainian officials, including Rustem Umerov, the lead Ukrainian negotiator, about the possibility of more talks. But Witkoff and Kushner were also there talking in indirect talks with Iran. So they were trying to do two things at once. Well, what's happened since then on the Saturday is the Trump camp have decided to go with this war on Iran to try to break the regime or force it to accept American demands. And when you're in the midst of waging that war, because the regime is not surrendering, We know that from its retaliation today. If the regime's not surrendering, you've got to devote a lot of your military and your political effort to handling that war. You can't then go off and say, oh, here we are. Now we're going to go over and mediate these talks between Ukraine and Russia. Again, especially if you think those talks are on the verge of a breakthrough. So no, I think this is spin. I think this is spin that, oh yeah, we can all get together, we can all meet. The war in Iran doesn't affect us. No, the war in Iran does affect us. It affects so many things we could talk about. It affects the price of oil. It's dramatically affect European gas prices today. It is affecting the U.S. military posture. So therefore, it is going to affect where the Americans, what they're capable of doing and what they're willing to do in terms of trying to get a Ukraine-Russia settlement.
We just began talking about the war in Iran, so let's do some deep dive and analyze this big war in the Middle East, and let's cover also Russia's position. Russian dictator Vladimir Putin says that, quote, this was a cynical and not moral attack against the supreme leader of Iran. Is this war beneficial or harmful for Russia, Putin's regime? You just mentioned about oil prices went high. However, Iran is a close ally to Russia and provided Russia with critical tools, Shahed drones, and some interesting electronics. And with this scheme, how to build Shahed drones en masse. What is your take on that?
Well, first of all, let's just highlight the hypocrisy of a Russian leader who, remember, is wanted for war crimes over the deportation of Ukrainian children, whose forces have carried out mass killings of civilians in Ukraine, whose forces have carried out mass executions or carried out executions of Ukrainian POWs, whose forces have, of course, invaded a full-scale invasion of Ukraine for more than 4 years. And then that same Russian leader says that the US and Israel attacks are cynical and not moral. Well, yeah. And guess what, Vladimir? If we're going to talk about cynical, immoral attacks, let's hold up a mirror to your face. Yeah, okay, that's no surprise. I mean, the Russians are going to sit there and pose as being the defenders of peace and the defenders of those who have been attacked when they have created war and when they have attacked people relentlessly. What does it mean in terms of practice? I mean, the Russians are indebted to Iran. They're indebted to Iran for, as you mentioned, the mass production and supply of those Shahed kamikaze drones at a time when Russia had not been able to develop their own drone production. They're indebted to the Iranians for helping them get those production lines in Russia started and developed. So Russia's not going to walk away from Iran, especially because beyond the military support, Iran's one of the few political supporters of the Russians in the world. Russians are largely isolated. So Russia, which at one time had, Putin at one time had a tactically close relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu. I've actually written about it. In 2015, they had a huge agreement in terms of how they would handle the Middle East. Well, that's long gone. The Russians are now turning against the Israelis, and it's now like, okay, we're going to defend Iran, both in terms of the PR, the posture that we defend victims, and then also because we're going to protect our political and military position. I don't think the Russian, line is going to make that much difference for the course of what happens in Iran and indeed the region in the next few days. I think the Russians are largely powerless, to be honest with you, as is most of the international community in the face of the U.S.-Israeli attacks. Nor do I think what's happening in Iran is going to have that much immediate effect on the state of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, it could have one significant effect that I think could play out, and that is the rise in energy prices. And here we're looking at oil prices had already gone up by around about 15% since Saturday. Then we're looking at European gas prices today, in part because of the general expansion of the conflict, in part specifically because Qatar has just halted production of liquefied natural gas because of a drone attack. European gas prices have jumped almost 40% today. So, like almost 40% in a few hours. Well, that type of rise in oil prices does two things. First of all, it puts pressure on European economies. And of course, Europeans are a big supporter of Ukraine. It puts pressure on European economies at a time when they're trying to completely get away from Russian oil and gas supplies by 2027. And secondly, in the meantime, it raises questions about whether the sanctions will prevent Russia from reaping profits from these increased oil and gas prices. This is where the cap, for example, on oil at $60 per barrel comes into play. That if the oil price per barrel is now around $72, $73, which it was last time I checked, that means, Russia potentially could break the cap and pick up a lot of badly needed revenue for its military effort. It's probably going to be a question of how long the U.S.-Israeli war goes. If it stops in the next few days, not much of effect if it continues, and if it expands, especially with attacks on the Gulf states, then that's a serious disruption to the energy markets, and it is something from which the Russians could profit.
You just also mentioned about sanctions and this oil price cap. We also should cover another development because France and Belgium have seized a Russian shadow fleet tanker in the North Sea this weekend, according to a statement made also by French President Emmanuel Macron. And this was a joint French-Belgian operation. President Zelensky welcomed this step and this success. What is your assessment of this operation, and from your perspective, could we expect another seizures of Russian oil tankers, shadow fleet?
I think this is a big question, and I'm glad you've raised it. There sort of was a door that was opened up by the Venezuela operations of the United States, because as the Trump camp tried to get the surrender of the regime in Caracas, they've been seizing tankers carrying Venezuelan oil or trying to load Venezuelan oil. And that included seizing a Russian flagged tanker a few weeks ago up between Iceland and Scotland. Well, that precedent of just going in and seizing tankers, you look at what the Europeans could do. So like France and Belgium get a hold of one tanker in Russia's shadow fleet. What about other European countries? What about the UK, for example, with its navy? Could you actually tighten the restrictions on Russia by preventing it from being able to move oil? So yeah, potentially very, 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 very significant. But it raises the question of the military resources these countries have to track and seize the tankers. And it raises the question of political will, because the Russians will claim they're the victim. They'll claim, what? Why are you doing this to us? We're not doing anything wrong. Do you have the political will to stick with this? Especially when you can guarantee a couple of countries within the EU, Hungary and Slovakia, are probably going to object.
Don't you think that this could be seen by Russia as possible warning, possible message sent to Russian dictator Vladimir Putin by European nations? Like, we can't do this if you continue this war against Ukraine, because we have not seen major seizures of oil, like Russian oil tankers and mass tens of tankers, because we know that this shadow fleet consists of probably not hundreds, but 1,000 vessels in this shadow fleet carrying out and transporting Russia's seaborne oil. Do you see this as a message to Russian dictator Vladimir Putin?
I think it's not only a message to Putin. I think it's a pragmatic step in terms of what you do. Look, when we talk about sanctions on Russia, we primarily are talking about economic measures. right? It's like, okay, we're going to try to, limit exports. We're going to limit imports. We're going to cut Russian banks off from the international financial markets. And that's all well and good. But what you're talking about here is something that goes beyond economic measures. These, in fact, are military measures, right? So this is a military enforcement of the sanctions. And that raises it. When you're willing to put your military in there because you're willing to risk a clash with the Russians by doing it, this is where Europe needs to be positioned. I mean, they've passed 19 packages of sanctions. They have tried to put limits on Russian oil. They have tried to say we're coming out of all purchases of Russian oil and gas by 2027. But if Russia's going to continue to ship oil, getting around the sanctions and finding customers for that oil, what do? You have to cut off the source. And what's the source here? It's the tankers. They're the ones that are carrying the oil. So I think this is a logical step. And if you actually read the statements, both in terms of European leaders who have favored the tightened sanctions and of President Zelensky, this is what they've been hinting at. President Zelensky has been hinting at Europe, take stronger measures against the shadow fleet. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't just simply mean putting these vessels on the sanctions list. It means actually enforcing the sanctions list by seizing the tankers and saying you're operating illegally.
Let's also cover more deeply this situation in Iran. And first question would be probably regarding US politics. Does this decision of President Trump to attack, to declare war, probably to conduct war against Iran, does this decision mean that he supports Marco Rubio's side and Marco Rubio's team fraction, right, inside the White House? Because J.D. Vance was observing this operation from another location. He wasn't near President Trump. However, Marco Rubio was.
No, I don't think that's the case. I mean, I think you have to remember that it's highly unusual for a U.S. president to be carrying out, the oversight of going to war, doing it from a location which is not in the White House. That's where the Situation Room is. That's almost where every war has been launched by the United States. In this case, Trump, and this is the second time he's done this. He did it also, I think, with the Venezuela operations. He's actually done this from elsewhere. He sets up a Situation Room just because he prefers to be down in Mar-a-Lago, and also possibly because it was trying to lull the Iranians into a sense of false security by saying, oh, he's not in Washington, so the U.S. won't attack this weekend. The fact that Rubio was down there with him, no, and that Vance was in Washington, no. You've got people who are back in Washington because there's other items of business you have to deal with. So it doesn't surprise me that they're up there. I think what's more important is that even though, as you and I have discussed, Rubio and Vance differ on certain issues, and they differ in terms of approach, I think they're unified here because this is an approach which isn't regime change as much as trying to assert American dominance and trying to make the regime obey you. And I think Vance reportedly actually had issues about this going to war. He worried, I think in part because of the military assessments, that this could drag out, that this might erode Trump's support and therefore his support when he runs for president, that this also goes against the Trump promise of no foreign interventions in the campaign. Rubio, I think, was probably more forthright in saying, okay, well, if we're going to do this, let's go ahead and not just simply go half-heartedly. Let's just go after the regime's leadership. But I think what unites all of them, Vance, Rubio, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, and of course Donald Trump, is this quest for American dominance, which is, Venezuela. We kidnap your president. We're going to let the rest of the regime stay in place, but you have to accept our dominance. Greenland, we're going to go in, we're going to seize Greenland because we want it. It's part of our national security. Europe, you just have to accept that. Trying to break up the EU. Well, Europe, this is just the way. You have to accept our approach because we would prefer to work with governments on a bilateral basis, especially if they're hard right governments. So with Middle East and Iran, it's just like, okay, we're returning to a position of American dominance in the Middle East and Iran. And there's an interesting comparison to be made. I mean, this is similar, very different times. The Trump administration is very chaotic, not very well organized at times, but it is similar to what the Bush administration tried with Iraq in 2003. Iraq was not, certainly wasn't about WMDs. It wasn't entirely about oil. It wasn't entirely about Saddam Hussein. It was about showing American dominance, that America was the world superpower. Well, the problem for America is that didn't turn out too well. And so here, more than 20 years later, you've got Trump people who want to look dominant. How do they do it? Well, we can't use ground troops. That didn't go well in Iraq, didn't go well in Afghanistan. Can't use ground troops, but we could kidnap foreign leaders or we can assassinate them. And maybe we show off our power and we establish control by doing it this way.
What's the objective here? Regime change or just forcing Iran to make serious concessions in this nuclear program negotiations, or just to project power in the Middle East?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think it's a vital one that analysts need to get a hold of, because when this operation hit on Saturday, I woke up to it and got the news flash. And my immediate thought was, okay, this is the Israel-U.S. attempted regime change, again, through targeted assassinations, the political and military leadership. And we know that Israel had tried to do this back in June 2025. But as this has gone on, I actually didn't know. I think the Trump camp and the Netanyahu government are on different pages here. They can share different pages because they have a common interest in limiting the Iran regime. But for Israel, I think, or at least for Netanyahu, this is like, we want to wipe out the regime. We don't want any elements of it left. We don't know who's going to take power, but we're just going to knock out everyone and then hope that we get a different type of leadership who are not threatening us. For the Americans, for the Trump camp, it's not about regime change, because look at the signals that have come out, not just from Donald Trump, but from advisors, which is, okay, if Iran will come back into talks, and if Iran will give us what we want, this can stop. And what is it the Americans want? What is it that they wanted all the way up to last Thursday in the talks? They wanted an end to Iran's nuclear program completely. Not just no military program, no civilian program, no enrichment at all. And that goes beyond what was agreed in 2015 when Iran agreed with the 5+1 powers, including the US, that it could have some enrichment up to about 3.67% of uranium. Now, no enrichment at all. And then the Americans wanted Iran to give up or limit its ballistic missiles in terms of the number, in terms of the range, in terms of the firepower. And the Iranians said, no, we'll discuss the nuclear program with you and limits on nuclear activities, but we're not going to discuss the missiles. So on Thursday, after the Geneva talks, the American envoys, real estate developer Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, they just walked away. They didn't make any comment. And I think at that point, the decision is made that they're going to go to war with Iran. But it could be that they're going to Iran after killing some of the top leaders so that the remaining leaders in the government agree to their demands. And again, there's a precedent for this. Ultimately, it was not regime change in Venezuela. For all the talk of regime change for months before the US operations, the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, the president, was not followed by getting rid of the rest of the regime. The vice president became president, acting president, Delcy Rodriguez. The interior minister stayed, the defense minister stayed. And indeed, we have found out subsequently that the regime, in order to survive, gave up Maduro. They told the Americans, okay, if you kidnap Maduro, we're not going to stand in your way. In this case, a little bit different. I don't think anybody in the Iranian regime said, okay, come in and kill the supreme leader. But I do think those that are left, if they choose, can surrender to the United States and still stay in power.
And most final question, and I would really appreciate as short answer as possible. Why didn't French and British governments support this operation from the day one? Don't you think that they have already been affected by this war because of most recent strikes on their military sites? And do you feel that both UK and France can change their positions?
They didn't support it initially, especially in the UK case, because the war's illegal. The UK government's legal advisors gave them the position paper, which stated what was fairly clear, and that is you can only go to war, what we call a preemptive war, if you face an imminent threat from a country. Well, Iran does not yet have a military nuclear program, certainly doesn't have the 150, 200 nuclear warheads Israel has. It was not threatening an immediate attack on the United States or on American troops in the region. It was not threatening an attack on Israel. So you had no justification to go in at that point, and you certainly had no justification to go in for targeted assassinations of a country's leader. So if you don't have legal justification, that makes it a bit tricky. And again, the UK back in 2003, they knew that war was illegal. At the end of the day, Blair joined it. I think this time his successor said, we're not going to go that same route. So they did not give permission for the U.S. to use the base of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. But now the UK has had to change its position because they cannot stand aside if Iran winds up killing American troops, and 4 have died so far. They can't stand aside if Iran hits the Gulf states or other countries. And so they have given permission for the U.S. to use Diego Garcia, that base in the Indian Ocean, albeit supposedly for defensive operations. In other words, to hit Iran's missile launchers. The UK is already being pulled into being an accomplice of this U.S.-Israel war, even if they didn't want to be in this position. I think France is a little bit different. They have a slightly different relationship with the United States. They don't have the same shared military facilities. So I think the French position lands on the fact that they'll keep calling for de-escalation. They will criticize the Iranian retaliation and strikes, but they'll use that word of de-escalation to also signal to Trump and Israel that they need to back off of the aim of regime change or regime surrender.
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your time and for your support for Ukraine and other in-depth conversation, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Thank you, Daniel. Thank your viewers.